On the way out to Harper's Ferry, I had met Mr. Robert Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He seemed very anxious to know when workmen might be put upon the road again so as to make repairs and put it in shape for running. It was a large piece of property to have standing idle. I told him I could not answer then positively, but would try and inform him before a great while. On my return, Mr. Garrett met me again with the same question, and I told him I thought that by the following Wednesday he might send his workmen out on his road. I gave him no further information, however, and he had no suspicion of how I expected to have the road cleared for his workmen. Sheridan moved at the time he had fixed upon. He met Early at the crossing of Opequon Creek and won a most decisive victory, one which electrified the country. Early had invited this attack himself by his bad generalship and made the victory easy. He had sent G.T. Anderson's division east of the Blue Ridge before I went to Harper's Ferry, and about the time I arrived there he started with 2 other divisions, leaving but 2 in their camps, to march to Martinsburg for the purpose of destroying the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad at that point. Early here learned that I had been with Sheridan, and supposing there was some movement on foot, started back as soon as he got the information. But his forces were separated and, as I have said, he was very badly defeated. He fell back to Fisher's Hill, Sheridan following. The valley is narrow at that point, and Early made another stand there, behind works which extended across. But Sheridan turned both his flanks and again sent him speeding up the valley, following in hot pursuit. The pursuit was continued up the valley to Mount Jackson and New Market. Sheridan captured about 1,100 prisoners and 16 guns. The houses which he passed all along the route were found to be filled with Early's wounded, and the country swarmed with his deserters. Finally, on the 25th, Early turned from the valley eastward, leaving Sheridan at Harrisonburg in undisputed possession. Now one of the main objects of the expedition began to be accomplished. Sheridan went to work with his command, gathering in the crops, cattle, and everything in the upper part of the valley required by our troops, and especially taking what might be of use to the enemy. What he could not take away he destroyed, so that the enemy would not be invited to come back there. I congratulated Sheridan upon his recent great victory, and had a salute of 100 guns fired in honour of it, the guns being aimed at the enemy around Petersburg. I also notified the other commanders throughout the country, who also fired salutes in honour of his victory. I had reason to believe that the administration was a little afraid to have a decisive battle fought at that time, for fear it might go against us and have a bad effect on the November elections. The convention, which had met and made its nomination of the Democratic candidate for the presidency, had declared the war a failure. Treason was talked as boldly in Chicago at that convention as ever it had been in Charleston. It was a question whether the government would then have had the power to make arrests and punish those who thus talked treason. But this decisive victory was the most effective campaign argument made in the canvass. Sheridan, in his pursuit, got beyond where they could hear from him in Washington, and the president became very much frightened about him. He was afraid that the hot pursuit had been a little like that of General Cass was said to have been in one of our Indian wars, when he was an officer of the army. Cass was pursuing the Indians so closely that the first thing he knew he found himself in their front and the Indians pursuing him. The president was afraid that Sheridan had got on the other side of Early and that Early was in behind him. He was afraid that Sheridan was getting so far away that reinforcements would be sent out from Richmond to enable Early to beat him. I replied to the president that I had taken steps to prevent Lee from sending reinforcements to Early by attacking the former where he was. On the 28th of September, to retain Lee in his position, I sent Ord with the 18th Corps and Birney with the 10th Corps to make an advance on Richmond to threaten it. Ord moved with the left wing up to Chaffin's Bluff. Birney with the 10th Corps took a road farther north, while Kautz with the cavalry took the Derby Road, still farther to the north. They got across the river by the next morning and made an effort to surprise the enemy. In that, however, they were unsuccessful. The enemy's lines were very strong and very intricate. Stannard's division of the 18th Corps, with General Burnham's brigade leading, tried an assault against Fort Harrison and captured it with 16 guns and a good many prisoners. Burnham was killed in the assault. Colonel Stevens, who succeeded him, was badly wounded, and his successor also fell in the same way. Some works to the right and left were also carried with the guns in them, 6 in number, and a few more prisoners. Birney's troops to the right captured the enemy's entrenched picket lines, but were unsuccessful in their efforts upon the main line. Our troops fortified their new position, bringing Fort Harrison into the new line and extending it to the river. This brought us pretty close to the enemy on the north side of the James, and the two opposing lines maintained their relative positions to the close of the siege. In the afternoon, a further attempt was made to advance, but it failed. Ord fell badly wounded and had to be relieved. The command devolved upon General Heckman, and later General Weitzel was assigned to the command of the 18th Corps. During the night, Lee reinforced his troops about Fort Gilmer, which was at the right of Fort Harrison, by transferring 8 additional brigades from Petersburg, and attempted to retake the works which we had captured by concentrating 10 brigades against them. All their efforts failed, their attacks being all repulsed with very heavy loss. In one of these assaults upon us, General Stannard, a gallant officer who was defending Fort Harrison, lost an arm. Our casualties during these operations amounted to 394 killed, 1,554 wounded, and 324 missing. Whilst this was going on, General Meade was instructed to keep up an appearance of moving troops to our extreme left. Park and Warren were kept with 2 divisions each under arms, ready to move, leaving their enclosed batteries manned, with a scattering line on the other entrenchments. The object of this was to prevent reinforcements from going to the north side of the river. Meade was instructed to watch the enemy closely, and if Lee weakened his lines, to make an attack. On the 30th, these troops moved out under Warren and captured an advanced entrenched camp at Peebles Farm, driving the enemy back to the main line. Our troops followed and made an attack in the hope of carrying the enemy's main line, but in this they were unsuccessful and lost a large number of men, mostly captured. The number of killed and wounded was not large. The next day our troops advanced again and established themselves, entrenching a new line about a mile in front of the enemy. This advanced Warren's position on the Weldon Railroad very considerably. Sheridan, having driven the enemy out of the valley and taken the productions of the valley, so that instead of going there for supplies, the enemy would have to bring his provisions with him if he again entered it, recommended a reduction of his own force, the surplus to be sent where it could be of more use. I approved of his suggestion and ordered him to send Wright's corps back to the James River. I further directed him to repair the railroad up the Shenandoah Valley towards the advanced position which we would hold with a small force. The troops were to be sent to Washington by way of Culpeper, in order to watch the east side of the Blue Ridge and prevent the enemy from getting into the rear of Sheridan while he was still doing his work of destruction. The valley was so very important, however, to the Confederate army that, contrary to our expectations, they determined to make one more strike and save it if possible before the supplies should be all destroyed. Reinforcements were sent therefore to Early, and this before any of our troops had been withdrawn. Early prepared to strike Sheridan at Harrisonburg, but the latter had not remained there. On the 6th of October, Sheridan commenced retiring down the valley, taking or destroying all the food and forage and driving the cattle before him, Early following. At Fisher's Hill, Sheridan turned his cavalry back on that of Early, which, under the lead of Rosser, was pursuing closely and routed it most completely, capturing 11 guns and a large number of prisoners. Sheridan lost only about 60 men. His cavalry pursued the enemy back some 25 miles. On the 10th of October, the march down the valley was again resumed, Early again following. I now ordered Sheridan to halt, and to improve the opportunity, if afforded by the enemy's having been sufficiently weakened, to move back again and cut the James River Canal and Virginia Central Railroad. But this order had to go through Washington, where it was intercepted. and when Sheridan received what purported to be a statement of what I wanted him to do, it was something entirely different. Halleck informed Sheridan that it was my wish for him to hold a forward position as a base from which to act against Charlottesville and Gordonsville, that he should fortify this position and provision it. Sheridan objected to this most decidedly, and I was impelled to telegraph him on the 14th as follows: City Point, VA, October 14th, 1864, 12:30 p.m. Major General Sheridan, Cedar Creek, VA. What I want is for you to threaten the Virginia Central Railroad and Canal in the manner your judgment tells you is best, holding yourself ready to advance if the enemy draw off their forces. If you make the enemy hold a force equal to your own for the protection of those thoroughfares, it will accomplish nearly as much as their destruction. If you cannot do this, then the next best thing to do is to send here all the force you can. I deem a good cavalry force necessary for your offensive, as well as defensive operations. You need not therefore send here more than one division of cavalry. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Sheridan, having been summoned to Washington City, started on the 15th, leaving Wright in command. His army was then at Cedar Creek, some 20 miles south of Winchester. The next morning, while at Front Royal, Sheridan received a dispatch from Wright, saying that a dispatch from Longstreet to Early had been intercepted. It directed the latter to be ready to move and to crush Sheridan as soon as he, Longstreet, arrived. On the receipt of this news, Sheridan ordered the cavalry up the valley to join Wright. On the 18th of October, Early was ready to move, and during the night succeeded in getting his troops in the rear of our left flank, which fled precipitately and in great confusion down the valley, losing 18 pieces of artillery and 1,000 or more prisoners. The right under General Getty maintained a firm and steady front, falling back to Middletown, where it took a position and made a stand. The cavalry went to the rear, seized the roads leading to Winchester, and held them for the use of our troops in falling back, General Wright having ordered a retreat back to that place. Sheridan, having left Washington on the 18th, reached Winchester that night. The following morning he started to join his command. He had scarcely got out of town when he met his men returning in panic from the front, and also heard heavy firing to the south. He immediately ordered the cavalry at Winchester to be deployed across the valley to stop the stragglers. Leaving members of his staff to take care of Winchester and the public property there, he set out with a small escort directly for the scene of battle. As he met the fugitives, he ordered them to turn back, reminding them that they were going the wrong way. His presence soon restored confidence. Finding themselves worse frightened than hurt, the men did halt and turn back. Many of those who had run 10 miles got back in time to redeem their reputation as gallant soldiers before night. When Sheridan got to the front, he found Getty and Custer still holding their ground firmly between the Confederates and our retreating troops. Everything in the rear was now ordered up. Sheridan at once proceeded to entrench his position, and he awaited an assault from the enemy. This was made with vigour, and was directed principally against Emory's corps, which had sustained the principal loss in the first attack. By 1 o'clock, the attack was repulsed. Early was so badly damaged that he seemed disinclined to make another attack, but went to work to entrench himself with a view to holding the position he had already gained. He thought, no doubt, that Sheridan would be glad enough to leave him unmolested, but in this he was mistaken. About the middle of the afternoon, Sheridan advanced. He sent his cavalry by both flanks, and they penetrated to the enemy's rear. The contest was close for a time, but at length the left of the enemy broke, and disintegration along the whole line soon followed. Early tried to rally his men, but they were followed so closely that they had to give way very quickly every time they attempted to make a stand. Our cavalry, having pushed on and got in the rear of the Confederates, captured 24 pieces of artillery, besides retaking what had been lost in the morning. This victory pretty much closed the campaigning in the Valley of Virginia. All the Confederate troops were sent back to Richmond, with the exception of one division of infantry and a little cavalry. Wright's corps was ordered back to the Army of the Potomac, and 2 other divisions were withdrawn from the valley. Early had lost more men in killed, wounded, and captured in the valley than Sheridan had commanded from first to last. On more than one occasion in these engagements, General R.B. Hayes, who succeeded me as President of the United States, bore a very honourable part. His conduct on the field was marked by conspicuous gallantry, as well as the display of qualities of a higher order than that of mere personal daring. This might well have been expected of one who could write at the time he is said to have done so. Any officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped. Having entered the army as a major of volunteers at the beginning of the war, General Hayes attained by meritorious service the rank of brevet major general before its close. On the north side of the James River, the enemy attacked Coutz's cavalry on the 7th of October and drove it back with heavy loss in killed, wounded and prisoners, and the loss of all the artillery. This was followed up by an attack on our entrenched infantry line, but was repulsed with severe slaughter. On the 13th, a reconnaissance was sent out by General Butler, with a view to drive the enemy from some new works he was constructing, which resulted in heavy loss to us. On the 24th, I ordered General Meade to attempt to get possession of the South Side Railroad, and for that purpose to advance on the 27th. The attempt proved a failure, however, the most advanced of our troops not getting nearer than within 6 miles of the point aimed for. Seeing the impossibility of its accomplishment, I ordered the troops to withdraw, and they were all back in their former positions the next day. Butler, by my directions, also made a demonstration on the north side of the James River in order to support this move, by detaining there the Confederate troops who were on that side. He succeeded in this, but failed of further results by not marching past the enemy's left, before turning in on the Derby Road, and by reason of simply coming up against their lines in place. This closed active operations around Richmond for the winter. Of course, there was frequent skirmishing between pickets, but no serious battle was fought near either Petersburg or Richmond. It would prolong this work to give a detailed account of all that took place from day to day around Petersburg and at other parts of my command, and it would not interest the general reader if given. All these details can be found by the military student in a series of books published by the Scribners, Badeau's History of My Campaigns, and also in the publications of the War Department, including both the National and Confederate reports. In the latter part of November, General Hancock was relieved from the command of the Sooty Corps by the Secretary of War and ordered to Washington to organize and command a corps of veteran troops to be designated the First Corps. It was expected that this would give him a large command to cooperate with in the spring. It was my expectation at the time that in the final operations Hancock should move either up the valley or else east of the Blue Ridge to Lynchburg, the idea being to make the spring campaign the close of the war. I expected, with Sherman coming up from the south, Meade south of Petersburg and around Richmond, and Thomas's command in Tennessee with depots of supplies established in the eastern part of that state, to move from the direction of Washington or the valley towards Lynchburg. We would then have Lee so surrounded that his supplies would be cut off entirely, making it impossible for him to support his army. General Humphreys, Chief of Staff of the Army of the Potomac, was assigned to the command of the Sode Corps to succeed Hancock. Chapter 59. The Campaign in Georgia, Sherman's March to the Sea, War Anecdotes, the March on Savannah, Investment of Savannah, Capture of Savannah. Let us now return to the operations in the military division of the Mississippi and accompany Sherman in his march to the sea. The possession of Atlanta by us narrowed the territory of the enemy very materially and cut off one of his 2 remaining lines of roads from east to west. A short time after the fall of Atlanta, Mr. Davis visited Palmetto and Macon and made speeches at each place. He spoke at Palmetto on the 20th of September and at Macon on the 22nd. Inasmuch as he had relieved Johnston and appointed Hood, and Hood had immediately taken the initiative, it is due to suppose that Mr. Davis was disappointed with General Johnston's policy. My own judgment is that Johnston acted very wisely. He husbanded his men and saved as much of his territory as he could, without fighting decisive battles in which all might be lost. As Sherman advanced, as I have shown, his army became spread out, until, if this had been continued, it would have been easy to destroy it in detail. I know that both Sherman and I were rejoiced when we heard of the change. Hood was unquestionably a brave, gallant soldier and not destitute of ability, but unfortunately his policy was to fight the enemy wherever he saw him, without thinking much of the consequences of defeat. In his speeches, Mr. Davis denounced Governor Brown of Georgia and General Johnston in unmeasured terms, even insinuating that their loyalty to the Southern cause was doubtful. So far as General Johnston is concerned, I think Davis did him a great injustice in this particular. I had known the general before the war, and strongly believed it would be impossible for him to accept a high commission for the purpose of betraying the cause he had espoused. Then, as I have said, I think that his policy was the best one that could have been pursued by the whole South: protract the war, which was all that was necessary to enable them to gain recognition in the end. The North was already growing weary, as the South evidently was also, but with this difference. In the North, the people governed and could stop hostilities whenever they chose to stop supplies. The South was a military camp, controlled absolutely by the government with soldiers to back it, and the war could have been protracted, no matter to what extent the discontent reached, up to the point of open mutiny of the soldiers themselves. Mr. Davis's speeches were frank appeals to the people of Georgia and that portion of the South to come to their relief. He tried to assure his frightened hearers that the Yankees were rapidly digging their own graves, but measures were already being taken to cut them off from supplies from the north, and that with a force in front and cut off from the rear, they must soon starve in the midst of a hostile people. Immediately reached the northern states, and they were republished. Of course, that caused no alarm papers containing reports of these speeches so long as telegraphic communication was kept up with Sherman. When Hood was forced to retreat from Atlanta, he moved to the southwest and was followed by a portion of Sherman's army. He soon appeared upon the railroad in Sherman's rear, and with his whole army began destroying the road. At the same time, also, the work was begun in Tennessee and Kentucky, which Mr. Davis had assured his hearers at Palmetto and Macon would take place. He ordered Forrest, about the ablest cavalry general in the South, north for this purpose, and Forrest and Wheeler carried out their orders with more or less destruction, occasionally picking up a garrison. Forrest indeed performed the very remarkable feat of capturing, with cavalry, 2 gunboats and a number of transports, something the accomplishment of which is very hard to account for. Hood's army had been weakened by Governor Brown's withdrawing the Georgia state troops for the purpose of gathering in the season's crops for the use of the people and for the use of the army. This not only depleted Hood's forces, but it served a most excellent purpose in gathering in supplies of food and forage for the use of our army in its subsequent march. Sherman was obliged to push on with his force and go himself with portions of it hither and thither, until it was clearly demonstrated to him that with the army he then had, it would be impossible to hold the line from Atlanta back and leave him any force whatever with which to take the offensive. Had that plan been adhered to, very large reinforcements would have been necessary, and Mr. Davis's prediction of the destruction of the army would have been realized, or else Sherman would have been obliged to make a successful retreat, which Mr. Davis said in his speeches would prove more disastrous than Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. These speeches of Mr. Davis were not long in reaching Sherman. He took advantage of the information they gave, and made all the preparation possible for him to make to meet what now became expected, attempts to break his communications. Something else had to be done, and to Sherman's sensible and soldierly mind the idea was not long in dawning upon him, not only that something else had to be done, but what that something else should be. On September 10th, I telegraphed Sherman as follows: City Point, VA, September 10, 1864. Major General Sherman, Atlanta, Georgia. So soon as your men are sufficiently rested and preparations can be made, it is desirable that another campaign should be commenced. We want to keep the enemy constantly pressed to the end of the war. If we give him no peace whilst the war lasts, the end cannot be distant. Now that we have all of Mobile Bay that is valuable, I do not know, but it will be the best move to transfer Canby's troops to act upon Savannah, whilst you move on Augusta. I should like to hear from you, however, in this matter. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. Sherman replied promptly, "If I could be sure of finding provisions and ammunition at Augusta or Columbus, Georgia, I can march to Milledgeville and compel Hood to give up Augusta or Macon and then turn on the other. If you can manage to take the Savannah River as high up as Augusta or the Chattahoochee as far up as Columbus, I can sweep the whole state of Georgia." On the 12th, I sent a special messenger, one of my own staff, with a letter inviting Sherman's views about the next campaign. City Point, VA, September 12, 1864. Major General W. T. Sherman, commanding Mill Division of the Mississippi. I send Lieutenant Colonel Porter of my staff with this. Colonel Porter will explain to you the exact condition of affairs here better than I can do in the limits of a letter. Although I feel myself strong enough for offensive operations, I am holding on quietly to get advantage of recruits and convalescents who are coming forward very rapidly. My lines are necessarily very long, extending from deep bottom north of the James across the peninsula formed by the Appomattox and the James, and south of the Appomattox to the Weldon Road. This line is very strongly fortified and can be held with comparatively few men, but from its great length takes many in the aggregate. I propose, when I do move, to extend my left so as to control what is known as the South Side, or Lynchburg and Petersburg Road, then if possible to keep the Danville Road cut. At the same time this move is made, I want to send a force of from 6,000 to 10,000 men against Wilmington. The way I propose to do this is to land the men north of Fort Fisher and hold that point. At the same time, a large naval fleet will be assembled there, and the ironclads will run the batteries as they did at Mobile. This will give us the same control of the harbour of Wilmington that we now have of the harbour of Mobile. What you are to do with the forces at your command, I do not see. The difficulties of supplying your army, except when you are constantly moving, beyond where you are, I plainly see. If it had not been for Price's movements, Canby would have sent 12,000 more men to Mobile. From your command on the Mississippi, an equal number could have been taken. With these forces, my idea would have been to divide them, sending one half to Mobile and the other half to Savannah. You could then move as proposed in your telegram, so as to threaten Macon and Augusta equally. Whichever was abandoned by the enemy you could take and open up a new base of supplies. My object now in sending a staff officer is not so much to suggest operations for you, as to get your views and have plans matured by the time everything can be got ready. It will probably be the 5th of October before any of the plans herein indicated will be executed. If you have any promotions to recommend, send the names forward and I will approve them. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. This reached Sherman on September 20th. On the 25th of September, Sherman reported to Washington that Hood's troops were in his rear. He had provided against this by sending a division to Chattanooga and a division to Rome, Georgia, which was in the rear of Hood, supposing that Hood would fall back in the direction from which he had come to reach the railroad. At the same time, Sherman and Hood kept up a correspondence relative to the exchange of prisoners, the treatment of citizens, and other matters suitable to be arranged between hostile commanders in the field. On the 27th of September, I telegraphed Sherman as follows. City Point, VA, September 27th, 1864, 10:30 a.m. Major General Sherman. I have directed all recruits and new troops from the western states to be sent to Nashville to receive their further orders from you. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. On the 29th, Sherman sent Thomas back to Chattanooga and afterwards to Nashville with another division, Morgan's, of the advanced army. Sherman then suggested that, when he was prepared, his movements should take place against Milledgeville, and then to Savannah. His expectation at that time was to make this movement as soon as he could get up his supplies. Hood was moving in his own country, and was moving light so that he could make 2 miles to Sherman's 1. He depended upon the country to gather his supplies, and so was not affected by delays. As I have said, until this unexpected state of affairs happened, Mobile had been looked upon as the objective point of Sherman's army. It had been a favourite move of mine from 1862, when I first suggested to the then Commander-in-Chief that the troops in Louisiana, instead of frittering away their time in the Trans-Mississippi, should move against Mobile. I recommended this from time to time until I came into command of the army, the last of March 1864. Having the power in my own hands, I now ordered the concentration of supplies, stores, and troops in the Department of the Gulf about New Orleans, with a view to a move against Mobile, in support of, and in conjunction with, the other armies operating in the field. Before I came into command, these troops had been scattered over the Trans-Mississippi Department in such a way that they could not be, or were not, gotten back in time to take any part in the original movement. Hence the consideration, which had caused Mobile to be selected as the objective point for Sherman's army to find his next base of supplies after having cut loose from Atlanta, no longer existed. General G.M. Dodge, an exceedingly efficient officer, having been badly wounded, had to leave the army about the 1st of October. He was in command of 2 divisions of the 16th Corps, consolidated into one. Sherman then divided his army into the right and left wings, the right commanded by General O. Howard and the left by General Slocum. General Dodge's 2 divisions were assigned, one to each of these wings. Howard's command embraced the 15th and 17th Corps, and Slocum's the 14th and 20th Corps, commanded by Generals Jeff, C. Davis, and A. S. Williams. Generals Logan and Blair commanded the 2 corps composing the right wing. About this time they left to take part in the presidential election, which took place that year, leaving their corps to Osterhaus and Ransom. I have no doubt that their leaving was at the earnest solicitation of the War Department. General Blair got back in time to resume his command and to proceed with it throughout the march to the sea and back to the Grand Review at Washington. General Logan did not return to his command until after it reached Savannah. Logan felt very much aggrieved at the transfer of General Howard from that portion of the Army of the Potomac, which was then with the Western Army, to the command of the Army of the Tennessee, with which army General Logan had served from the Battle of Belmont to the fall of Atlanta, having passed successively through all grades from colonel commanding a regiment to general commanding a brigade, division, and army corps, until upon the death of McPherson the command of the entire Army of the Tennessee devolved upon him in the midst of a hotly contested battle. He conceived that he had done his full duty as commander in that engagement, and I can bear testimony from personal observation that he had proved himself fully equal to all the lower positions which he had occupied as a soldier. I will not pretend to question the motive which actuated Sherman in taking an officer from another army to supersede General Logan. I have no doubt whatever that he did this for what he considered would be to the good of the service, which was more important than that the personal feelings of any individual should not be aggrieved, though I doubt whether he had an officer with him who could have filled the place as Logan would have done. Differences of opinion must exist between the best of friends as to policies in war, and of judgment as to men's fitness. The officer who has the command, however, should be allowed to judge of the fitness of the officers under him, unless he is very manifestly wrong. Sherman's army, after all the depletions, numbered about 60,000 effective men. All weak men had been left to hold the rear, and those remaining were not only well men, but strong and hardy, so that he had 60,000 as good soldiers as ever trod the earth. Better than any European soldiers, because they not only worked like a machine, but the machine thought. European armies know very little what they are fighting for, and care less. Included in these 60,000 troops, there were 2 small divisions of cavalry, numbering altogether about 4,000 men. Hood had about 35 to 40,000 men, independent of Forrest, whose forces were operating in Tennessee and Kentucky, as Mr. Davis had promised they should. This part of Mr. Davis's military plan was admirable, and promised the best results of anything he could have done, according to my judgment. I say this because I have criticised his military judgment in the removal of Johnston and also in the appointment of Hood. I am aware, however, that there was high feeling existing at that time between Davis and his subordinate, whom I regarded as one of his ablest lieutenants. On the 5th of October, the railroad back from Atlanta was again very badly broken, Hood having got on the track with his army. Sherman saw, after night, from a high point, the road burning for miles. The defence of the railroad by our troops was very gallant, but they could not hold points between their entrenched positions against Hood's whole army. In fact, they made no attempt to do so, but generally the entrenched positions were held, as well as important bridges and stores located at them. Allatoona, for instance, was defended by a small force of men under the command of General Corse, one of the very able and efficient volunteer officers produced by the war. He, with a small force, was cut off from the remainder of the national army and was attacked with great vigour by many times his own number. Sherman, from his high position, could see the battle raging, with the Confederate troops between him and his subordinate. He sent men, of course, to raise the temporary siege, but the time that would be necessarily consumed in reaching Corse would be so great that all occupying the entrenchments might be dead. Corse was a man who would never surrender. From a high position, some of Sherman's signal corps discovered a signal flag waving from a hole in the blockhouse at Allatoona. It was from Corse. He had been shot through the face, but he signalled to his chief a message which left no doubt of his determination to hold his post at all hazards. It was at this point, probably, that Sherman first realised that with the forces at his disposal, the keeping open of his line of communications with the north would be impossible if he expected to retain any force with which to operate offensively beyond Atlanta. He proposed, therefore, to destroy the roads back to Chattanooga when all ready to move, and leave the latter place garrisoned. Yet, before abandoning the railroad, it was necessary that he should repair damages done and hold the road until he could get forward such supplies, ordnance stores, and small rations as he wanted to carry with him on his proposed march, and to return to the north his surplus artillery. His object being to move light and to have no more artillery than could be used to advantage on the field. Sherman thought Hood would follow him, though he proposed to prepare for the contingency of the latter moving the other way while he was moving south, by making Thomas strong enough to hold Tennessee and Kentucky. I, myself, was thoroughly satisfied that Hood would go north, as he did. On the 2nd of November, I telegraphed Sherman authorizing him definitely to move according to the plan he had proposed. That is, cutting loose from his base, giving up Atlanta and the railroad back to Chattanooga. To strengthen Thomas, he sent Stanley, 4th Corps, back, and also ordered Schofield, commanding the Army of the Ohio, 12,000 strong, to report to him. In addition to this, A.J. Smith, who, with 2 divisions of Sherman's army, was in Missouri aiding Rosecrans in driving the enemy from that state, was under orders to return to Thomas, and, under the most unfavourable circumstances, might be expected to arrive there long before Hood could reach Nashville. In addition to this, the new levies of troops that were being raised in the northwest went to Thomas as rapidly as enrolled and equipped. Thomas, without any of these additions spoken of, had a garrison at Chattanooga, which had been strengthened by 1 division, and garrisons at Bridgeport, Stevenson, Decatur, Murfreesboro, and Florence. There were already with him in Nashville 10,000 soldiers in round numbers, and many thousands of employees in the quartermasters and other departments who could be put in the entrenchments in front of Nashville for its defence. Also, Wilson was there with 10,000 dismounted cavalrymen who were being equipped for the field. Thomas had at this time about 45,000 men without any of the reinforcements here above enumerated. These reinforcements gave him altogether about 70,000 men, without counting what might be added by the new levies already spoken of. About this time, Beauregard arrived upon the field, not to supersede Hood in command, but to take general charge over the entire district in which Hood and Sherman were, or might be, operating. He made the most frantic appeals to the citizens for assistance to be rendered in every way, by sending reinforcements, by destroying supplies on the line of march of the invaders, by destroying the bridges over which they would have to cross, and by, in every way, obstructing the roads to their front. But it was hard to convince the people of the propriety of destroying supplies which were so much needed by themselves, and each one hoped that his own possessions might escape. Hood soon started north and went into camp near Decatur, Alabama, where he remained until the 29th of October, but without making an attack on the garrison of that place. The Tennessee River was patrolled by gunboats from Muscle Shoals east and also below the second shoals out to the Ohio River. These, with the troops that might be concentrated from the garrisons along the river at any point where Hood might choose to attempt to cross, made it impossible for him to cross the Tennessee at any place where it was navigable. But Muscle Shoals is not navigable, and below them again is another shoal which also obstructs navigation. Hood therefore moved down to a point nearly opposite Florence, Alabama, crossed over and remained there for some time, collecting supplies of food, forage, and ammunition. All of these had to come from a considerable distance south, because the region in which he was then situated was mountainous, with small valleys which produced but little, and what they had produced had long since been exhausted. On the 1st of November, I suggested to Sherman, and also asked his views thereon, the propriety of destroying Hood before he started on his campaign. On the 2nd of November, as stated, I approved definitely his making his proposed campaign through Georgia, leaving Hood behind to the tender mercy of Thomas and the troops in his command. Sherman fixed the 10th of November as the day of starting. Sherman started on that day to get back to Atlanta, and on the 15th the real march to the sea commenced. The right wing, under Howard, and the cavalry went to Jonesboro, Milledgeville, then the capital of Georgia, being Sherman's objective or stopping place on the way to Savannah. The left wing moved to Stone Mountain, along roads much farther east than those taken by the right wing. Slocum was in command and threatened Augusta as the point to which he was moving, but he was to turn off and meet the right wing at Milledgeville. Atlanta was destroyed so far as to render it worthless for military purposes before starting, Sherman himself remaining over a day to superintend the work and see that it was well done. Sherman's orders for this campaign were perfect. Before starting, he had sent back all sick, disabled, and weak men, retaining nothing but the hardy, well-inured soldiers to accompany him on his long march in prospect. His artillery was reduced to 65 guns. The ammunition carried with them was 200 rounds for musket and gun. Small rations were taken in a small wagon train, which was loaded to its capacity for rapid movement. The army was expected to live on the country, and to always keep the wagons full of forage and provisions against a possible delay of a few days. The troops, both of the right and left wings, made most of their advance along the line of railroads, which they destroyed. The method adopted to perform this work was to burn and destroy all the bridges and culverts, and for a long distance, at places, to tear up the track and bend the rails. Soldiers to do this rapidly would form a line along one side of the road with crowbars and poles, place these under the rails and, hoisting all at once, turn over many rods of road at one time. The ties would then be placed in piles, and the rails, as they were loosened, would be carried and put across these log heaps. When a sufficient number of rails were placed upon a pile of ties, it would be set on fire. This would heat the rails very much more in the middle, that being over the main part of the fire, than at the ends, so that they would naturally bend of their own weight, but the soldiers, to increase the damage, would take tongs and, 1 or 2 men at each end of the rail, carry it with force against the nearest tree and twist it around, thus leaving rails forming bands to ornament the forest trees of Georgia. All this work was going on at the same time, there being a sufficient number of men detailed for that purpose. Some piled the logs and built the fire, some put the rails upon the fire, while others would bend those that were sufficiently heated, so that by the time the last bit of road was torn up, that it was designed to destroy at a certain place, the rails previously taken up were already destroyed. The organisation for supplying the army was very complete. Each brigade furnished a company to gather supplies of forage and provisions for the command to which they belonged. Strict injunctions were issued against pillaging or otherwise unnecessarily annoying the people, but everything in shape of food for man and forage for beast was taken. The supplies were turned over to the brigade commissary and quartermaster, and were issued by them to their respective commands precisely the same as if they had been purchased. The captures consisted largely of cattle, sheep, poultry, some bacon, cornmeal, often molasses, and occasionally coffee or other small rations. The skill of these men, called by themselves and the army bummers, in collecting their loads and getting back to their respective commands, was marvellous. When they started out in the morning, they were always on foot, but scarcely one of them returned in the evening without being mounted on a horse or mule. These would be turned in for the general use of the army, and the next day these men would start out afoot and return again in the evening mounted. Many of the exploits of these men would fall under the head of romance. Indeed, I am afraid that in telling some of their experiences, the romance got the better of the truth upon which the story was founded, and that in the way many of these anecdotes are told, very little of the foundation is left. I suspect that most of them consist chiefly of the fiction added to make the stories better. In one instance, it was reported that a few men of Sherman's army passed a house where they discovered some chickens under the dwelling. They immediately proceeded to capture them, to add to the army's supplies. The lady of the house, who happened to be at home, made piteous appeals to have these spared, saying they were a few she had put away to save by permission of other parties who had preceded and who had taken all the others that she had. The soldiers seemed moved at her appeal, but looking at the chickens again they were tempted, and one of them replied, "The rebellion must be suppressed if it takes the last chicken in the Confederacy," and proceeded to appropriate the last one. Another anecdote characteristic of these times has been told. The South, prior to the rebellion, kept bloodhounds to pursue runaway slaves who took refuge in the neighbouring swamps, and also to hunt convicts. Orders were issued to kill all these animals as they were met with. On one occasion, a soldier picked up a poodle, the favourite pet of its mistress, and was carrying it off to execution when the lady made a strong appeal to him to spare it. The soldier replied, "Madam, our orders are to kill every bloodhound." "But this is not a bloodhound," said the lady. "Well, madam, we cannot tell what it will grow into if we leave it behind," said the soldier as he went off with it. Notwithstanding these anecdotes and the necessary hardship they would seem to imply, I do not believe there was much unwarrantable pillaging, considering that we were in the enemy's territory and without any supplies, except such as the country afforded. On the 23rd Sherman, with the left wing, reached Milledgeville. The right wing was not far off, but proceeded on its way towards Savannah, destroying the road as it went. The troops at Milledgeville remained over a day to destroy factories, buildings used for military purposes, etc., before resuming its march. The governor, who had been almost defying Mr. Davis before this, now fled precipitately, as did the legislature of the state and all the state officers. The governor, Sherman says, was careful to carry away even his garden vegetables, while he left the archives of the state to fall into our hands. The only military force that was opposed to Sherman's forward march was the Georgia militia, a division under the command of General G.W. Smith, and a battalion under Harry Wayne. Neither the quality of the forces nor their numbers was sufficient to even retard the progress of Sherman's army. The people at the South became so frantic at this time at the successful invasion of Georgia that they took the cadets from the military college and added them to the ranks of the militia. They even liberated the state convicts under promise from them that they would serve in the army. I have but little doubt that the worst acts that were attributed to Sherman's army were committed by these convicts, and by other Southern people who ought to have been under sentence, such people as could be found in every community, North and South, who took advantage of their country being invaded to commit crime. They were in but little danger of detection, or of arrest, even if detected. The Southern papers, in commenting upon Sherman's movements, pictured him as in the most deplorable condition. stating that his men were starving, that they were demoralized and wandering about almost without object, aiming only to reach the seacoast and get under the protection of our navy. These papers got to the north and had more or less effect upon the minds of the people, causing much distress to all loyal persons, particularly to those who had husbands, sons, or brothers with Sherman. Mr. Lincoln, seeing these accounts, had a letter written asking me if I could give him anything that he could say to the loyal people that would comfort them. I told him there was not the slightest occasion for alarm, that with 60,000 such men as Sherman had with him, such a commanding officer as he was, could not be cut off in the open country. He might possibly be prevented from reaching the point he had started out to reach, but he would get through somewhere and would finally get to his chosen destination. And even if worst came to worst, he could return north. I heard afterwards of Mr. Lincoln's saying to those who would inquire of him as to what he thought about the safety of Sherman's army, that Sherman was all right. Grant says they are safe with such a general, and that if they cannot get out where they want to, they can crawl back by the hole they went in at. While at Milledgeville, the soldiers met at the State House, organized a legislature, and proceeded to business precisely as if they were the legislative body belonging to the state of Georgia. The debates were exciting, and were upon the subject of the situation the South was in at that time, particularly the state of Georgia. They went so far as to repeal, after a spirited and acrimonious debate, the Ordinance of Secession. The next day, 24th, Sherman continued his march, going by the way of Waynesboro and Louisville, Millen being the next objective and where the two columns, the right and left wings, were to meet. The left wing moved to the left of the direct road, and the cavalry still farther off, so as to make it look as though Augusta was the point they were aiming for. They moved on all the roads they could find leading in that direction. The cavalry was sent to make a rapid march in hope of surprising Millen before the Union prisoners could be carried away. But they failed in this. The distance from Milledgeville to Millen was about 100 miles. At this point Wheeler, who had been ordered from Tennessee, arrived and swelled the numbers and efficiency of the troops confronting Sherman. Hyde, a native of Georgia, also came, but brought no troops with him. It was intended that he should raise as large an army as possible with which to intercept Sherman's march. He did succeed in raising some troops, and with these and those under the command of Wheeler and Wayne, had an army sufficient to cause some annoyance but no great detention. Our cavalry and Wheeler's had a pretty severe engagement, in which Wheeler was driven towards Augusta, thus giving the idea that Sherman was probably making for that point. Millen was reached on the 3rd of December, and the march was resumed the following day for Savannah, the final objective. Bragg had now been sent to Augusta with some troops. Wade Hampton was there also trying to raise cavalry sufficient to destroy Sherman's army. If he ever raised a force, it was too late to do the work expected of it. Hardee's whole force probably numbered less than 10,000 men. From Millen to Savannah, the country is sandy and poor, and affords but very little forage other than rice straw, which was then growing. This answered a very good purpose as forage, and the rice grain was an addition to the soldiers' rations. No further resistance worthy of note was met with, until within a few miles of Savannah. This place was found to be entrenched and garrisoned. Sherman proceeded at once on his arrival to invest the place, and found that the enemy had placed torpedoes in the ground, which were to explode when stepped on by man or beast. One of these exploded under an officer's horse, blowing the animal to pieces and tearing one of the legs of the officer so badly that it had to be amputated. Sherman at once ordered his prisoners to the front, moving them in a compact body in advance, to either explode the torpedoes or dig them up. No further explosion took place. On the 10th of December, the siege of Savannah commenced. Sherman then, before proceeding any further with operations for the capture of the place, started with some troops to open communication with our fleet, which he expected to find in the lower harbour, or as nearby as the forts of the enemy would permit. In marching to the coast he encountered Fort McAllister, which it was necessary to reduce before the supplies he might find on shipboard could be made available. Fort McAllister was soon captured by an assault made by General Hazen's division. Communication was then established with the fleet. The capture of Savannah then only occupied a few days and involved no great loss of life. The garrison, however, as we shall see, was enabled to escape by crossing the river and moving eastward. When Sherman had opened communication with the fleet, he found there a steamer, which I had forwarded to him, carrying the accumulated mails for his army, also supplies which I supposed he would be in need of. General J.G. Foster, who commanded all the troops south of North Carolina on the Atlantic seaboard, visited General Sherman before he had opened communication with the fleet, with the view of ascertaining what assistance he could be to him. Foster returned immediately to his own headquarters at Hilton Head for the purpose of sending Sherman siege guns, and also, if he should find he had them to spare, supplies of clothing, hard bread, etc., thinking that these articles might not be found outside. The mail on the steamer which I sent down had been collected by Colonel A. H. Markland of the Post Office Department, who went in charge of it. On this same vessel, I sent an officer of my staff, Lieutenant Dunn, with the following letter to General Sherman. City Point, VA, Decorum 3, 1864. Major General W. T. Sherman, commanding armies near Savannah, GA. The little information gleaned from the Southern press, indicating no great obstacle to your progress, I have directed your mails, which had been previously collected at Baltimore by Colonel Markland, Special Agent of the Post Office Department, to be sent as far as the blockading squadron off Savannah, to be forwarded to you as soon as heard from on the coast. Not liking to rejoice before the victory is assured, I abstain from congratulating you and those under your command until bottom has been struck. I have never had a fear, however, for the result. Since you left Atlanta, no very great progress has been made here. The enemy has been closely watched, though, and prevented from detaching against you. I think not one man has gone from here, except some 12 or 1500 dismounted cavalry. Bragg has gone from Wilmington. I am trying to take advantage of his absence to get possession of that place. Owing to some preparations, Admiral Porter and General Butler are making to blow up Fort Fisher, which, while hoping for the best, I do not believe a particle in. There is a delay in getting this expedition off. I hope they will be ready to start by the 7th, and that Bragg will not have started back by that time. In this letter I do not intend to give you anything like directions for future action, but will state a general idea I have, and will get your views after you have established yourself on the seacoast. With your veteran army, I hope to get control of the only 2 through routes from east to west possessed by the enemy before the fall of Atlanta. The condition will be filled by holding Savannah and Augusta, or by holding any other port to the east of Savannah and Branchville. If Wilmington falls, a force from there can cooperate with you. Thomas has got back into the defences of Nashville, with Hood close upon him. Decatur has been abandoned, and so have all the roads except the main one leading to Chattanooga. Part of this falling back was undoubtedly necessary, and all of it may have been. It did not look so, however, to me. In my opinion, Thomas far outnumbers Hood in infantry. In cavalry, Hood has the advantage in morale and numbers. I hope yet that Hood will be badly crippled if not destroyed. The general news you will learn from the papers better than I could give it. After all becomes quiet, and roads become so bad up here that there is likely to be a week or 2 when nothing can be done, I will run down the coast to see you. If you desire it, I will ask Mrs. Sherman to go with me. Yours truly, U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. I quote this letter because it gives the reader a full knowledge of the events of that period. Sherman now, the 15th, returned to Savannah to complete its investment and ensure the surrender of the garrison. The country about Savannah is low and marshy, and the city was well entrenched from the river above to the river below, and assaults could not be made except along a comparatively narrow causeway. For this reason, assaults must have resulted in serious destruction of life to the Union troops, with the chance of failing altogether. Sherman, therefore, decided upon a complete investment of the place. When he believed this investment completed, he summoned the garrison to surrender. General Hardee, who was in command, replied in substance that the condition of affairs was not such as Sherman had described. He said he was in full communication with his department and was receiving supplies constantly. Hardee, however, was cut off entirely from all communication with the west side of the river and by the river itself to the north and south. On the South Carolina side, the country was all rice fields through which it would have been impossible to bring supplies, so that Hardee had no possible communication with the outside world except by a dilapidated plank road starting from the west bank of the river. Sherman, receiving this reply, proceeded in person to a point on the coast where General Foster had troops stationed under General Hatch for the purpose of making arrangements with the latter officer to go through by one of the numerous channels running inland along that part of the coast of South Carolina to the plank road which General Hardee still possessed, and thus to cut him off from the last means he had of getting supplies, if not of communication. While arranging for this movement, and before the attempt to execute the plan had been commenced, Sherman received information through one of his staff officers that the enemy had evacuated Savannah the night before. This was the night of the 21st of December. Before evacuating the place, Hardee had blown up the Navy Yard. Some ironclads had been destroyed, as well as other property that might have been valuable to us. But he left an immense amount of stores untouched, consisting of cotton, railroad cars, workshops, numerous pieces of artillery, and several thousand stands of small arms. A little incident occurred soon after the fall of Savannah, which Sherman relates in his memoirs, and which is worthy of repetition. Savannah was one of the points where blockade runners entered. Shortly after the city fell into our possession, a blockade runner came sailing up serenely, not doubting but the Confederates were still in possession. It was not molested, and the captain did not find out his mistake until he had tied up and gone to the custom house, where he found a new occupant of the building, and made a less profitable disposition of his vessel and cargo than he had expected. As there was some discussion as to the authorship of Sherman's March to the Sea, by critics of his book when it appeared before the public, I want to state here that no question upon that subject was ever raised between General Sherman and myself. Circumstances made the plan on which Sherman expected to act impracticable, and as commander of the forces, he necessarily had to devise a new one which would give more promise of success. Consequently, he recommended the destruction of the railroad back to Chattanooga, and that he should be authorized then to move, as he did, from Atlanta forward. His suggestions were finally approved, although they did not immediately find favor in Washington. Even when it came to the time of starting, the greatest apprehension as to the propriety of the campaign he was about to commence filled the mind of the President, induced no doubt by his advisers. This went so far as to move the President to ask me to suspend Sherman's march for a day or two until I could think the matter over. My recollection is, though I find no record to show it, that out of deference to the President's wish I did send a dispatch to Sherman asking him to wait a day or two, or else the connections between us were already cut so that I could not do so. However this may be, the question of who devised the plan of march from Atlanta to Savannah is easily answered. It was clearly Sherman, and to him also belongs the credit of its brilliant execution. It was hardly possible that anyone else than those on the spot could have devised a new plan of campaign to supersede one that did not promise success. I was in favour of Sherman's plan from the time it was first submitted to me. My Chief of Staff, however, was very bitterly opposed to it, and, as I learned subsequently, finding that he could not move me, he appealed to the authorities at Washington to stop it.